Well, thank you all for having us. It's my great pleasure to be here with Iain McGilchrist. I'll read your official introduction. But actually, I think the one thing that strikes me is he's one of... I've sort of spent the last 2 months in the company of Iain, unbeknownst to him, reading this new book of his. And I've rarely encountered a book which is so passionate about cognition and the brain and so beautiful and eloquent. So this introduction, which I'm going to read, is very left brain, but I have a right brain introduction to you as well. So Dr. Iain McGilchrist is a psychiatrist, a philosopher, a literary scholar. He's Quondam Fellow of All Souls College, Oxford, and an Associate Fellow of Green Templeton College, Oxford. He's a Fellow of the Royal College of Psychiatrists, a Fellow of the Royal Society of Arts, and a former consultant psychiatrist and clinical director at the Bethlem Royal and Maudsley Hospital in London. He's been a research fellow in neuroimaging at Johns Hopkins Hospital in Baltimore and a fellow of the Institute of Advanced Studies in Stellenbosch. Iain's published original articles and research papers in a wide range of topics, including literature, philosophy, medicine, and psychiatry. He's the author of numerous books, maybe best known for his second to most recent, The Master and His Emissary, The Divided Brain and the Making of the Western World, from Yale University Press in 2009, and his newest book, The Matter with Things, Our Brains, Our Delusions, and the Unmaking of the World, published in November of last year by Perspectiva Press. Welcome, Dr. McGilchrist.
Thank you very much, Ash. It's a pleasure to be here.
So the book is huge, the most recent book. And I will say that Aer Lingus has a 10 kilogram baggage limit. 50% of my baggage was your book. And I was thinking, how am I going to introduce this subject, this hemispheric hypothesis, to an audience which will be, some of you will be neurologists and psychiatrists, some of you will know a lot about neuroanatomy, and some of you won't. How do I introduce? So I asked my son, who's 13, what would you say? What would be a simple way of describing this? And he says, it's like the divided stomach. He says, when I eat, he said, I get full from the mains, but I still have room for pudding because I've got a pudding stomach. And it's sort of functionally separate and dominant to the main stomach. It can kind of take over. So I think, anyway, what I'd like to do is, I imagine, so what we'll do is first we'll talk about some myths about the left brain and right brain, this hemisphere hypothesis, which I had heard a little bit before as a neurologist and a neuroscientist. We often think about hemispheric differences, hemispheric asymmetries. But Iain has really taken this idea to a profound epistemological and metaphysical level, really, really profound, much further than I think anyone has ever taken this idea before. So what we'll do with our hour today is first talk about some myths, what we've all probably come into this room thinking about in terms of left brain and right brain. And then ideally, we'll go through each of the 3 parts that Iain's laid out in his latest book. So the first part will be about neuroanatomy, the hemisphere hypothesis. The second part is really about epistemology, amazingly, the nature of how we know what we know. And the third part will be about metaphysics. So that sounds like a really light, that's quite an easy, that's a pretty easy thing. And then after the break, we'll cure cancer and talk about how to put people into black holes. Yeah. So I think it'll be straightforward.
Learn to play the flute and rid the world of all known evils.
Yeah, that's great. That's great.
I mean, I suppose I should first of all point out that the book that you can see displayed out there is my 2009 book, The Master and His Emissary, a slim volume by comparison at about 600 pages. Yeah. But the new book, The Matter with Things, I can't see that, but it's the one we're going to be talking about, yeah, and which took me the last 10 years to write. And my history goes back to, I was a late entrant to medicine. I started when I was 28, having previously been interested in philosophy and literature and taught at Oxford. And there's a story behind that, but we don't need to go into it. But then I found that this topic of hemisphere difference was very interesting, but being generally rubbished. And people said to me, don't go there. Please don't. You could have a great career, but if you touch this hemisphere thing, nobody will listen to you. But I knew enough about the differences between the hemispheres to think this was worth researching. Why, for a start, is the brain, which is whole purpose is to make connections, and whose power exists in making connections, why is it divided? Why are the 2 halves asymmetrical? Why is the band of fibers at the base of the brain that connects them, the corpus callosum, largely concerned with inhibition? There seem to be two things being kept apart. And indeed, as you go back, looking through evolution, you see that all brains that we know of have this asymmetry, and indeed, even the oldest neural networks before brains have an asymmetry. So there's something really interesting there. So what is not true is that the left hemisphere is kind of like a rather boring accountant. It's fairly reliable, but you wouldn't want to go to a dinner party with it. And the right hemisphere is kind of airy-fairy and paints pictures and, all that. In fact, the one that's much more down to earth, much more reliable, much more wary is the right hemisphere. And the one that can get carried away with jumping to conclusions and actually being quite angry is the left hemisphere. The emotion that most strongly lateralizes in the brain is anger, and it lateralizes to the left. So these are none of the things that people said, apart from one. I've got a little, sometimes when I'm lecturing, I put up the 20 things that are on the internet. They're all wrong apart from one, which is pretty well substantiated, which is a difference between looking at detail, focal attention in the left hemisphere, and broad, sustained, vigilant attention in the right. And that has consequences. Do you want me to talk about that, or do you want to jump in there?
What I wanted to say to those of you who haven't read Iain's this book, or maybe the previous one, that this anthropomorphizing the two hemispheres is a really interesting thing, where you say that the left hemisphere is angry, the left hemisphere is detail-oriented. And I think so often in science, with a book of this tremendous level of erudition, so often we shy away from these sorts of, we know what you mean when you say that, and you don't actually think there's two people in there.
No.
But what you do think, which is actually in a way more interesting and more profound, I think, is that there are possibly these two separate consciousnesses, or two really separate, simultaneous cognitive styles. And this is where I think, as someone who's been studying the brain my whole adult life, I don't think there are very many other people in neurology and neuroscience that take it that one step further. There's not just regional specialization in the brain, but there's actually two parallel consciousnesses.
Yes, I mean, we can see this because now we can suppress one hemisphere at a time, and instantly you get a picture of the other hemisphere's take. Prior to this, there were ways. We had the split brain operations starting in the 60s and 70s in California. We have people who have strokes, tumors, and there was something, the WADA test, in which people injected amylobarbitone into a carotid artery pre-operatively to find out where speech was. And so in that little window for 15 minutes, you could experience one or other of these hemispheres on their own. But really, when you're talking about them, you have a choice. You can either talk about them as though they're purely machines, or you can talk about them as though they were part of a person. And they're far more like part of a person than they are like a machine. So everything is an approximation. But the typical modern reductionist materialist idea is that everything is mechanical. I mean, physicists left this behind at least 100 years ago. But good old biologists plow on. With this idea that conscious beings are mechanical, but the unconscious world, according to physicists, is automatically connected to consciousness, all that inanimate stuff, highly conscious.
Yeah. So can you sort of summarize the hemisphere hypothesis?
Yeah, I'll have a go.
Right. I mean, in less than 679 pages.
I promise it will be less than 679 pages. To be as concise as I can, it seems that for good evolutionary reasons, each creature needs to be able to do two things at the same time, which require taking in two different versions of the world, basically. One is looking at a tiny detail that's brought into high resolution, and it's the thing that you want to get, because the left hemisphere controls the right hand that grabs, and it controls the part of language with which we say, I've grasped it. So it's the grasping bit, the manipulating bit, the bit that helps us do stuff to the environment. But the right hemisphere is the one that, meanwhile, is taking in everything else. Because while you're getting your lunch, you must be careful not to become somebody else's. And that means having a broad, open, sustained, vigilant attention. That is the role of the right hemisphere. Now, that may sound simple. And indeed, when I first heard that this attentional difference was extremely robust, and neurologists didn't for a moment dispute it, I thought, but that's, maybe that's just another cognitive function. And about a millisecond later, I thought, no, attention is how we understand the world. The kind of attention changes what we find, and it changes us who are doing the finding. So attention is a moral act that changes the world. And if that's so, it's worth exploring the kind of world that each kind of attention brings into being. And effectively, this very narrowly focused, targeted attention brings into being a world in which there are discrete, atomistic elements, relatively fixed, certain, familiar, known, categorizable. It's one of those, I need it for lunch. That kind of thing. It takes things out of context, it disembodies them, it abstracts them, and it deanimates them. Whereas the right hemisphere, meanwhile, is seeing that actually nothing is completely separate from everything else, that things are constantly changing and flowing, not fixed and certain, that a large part of what they have to tell us is implicit. It's not explicit. It's in the context. It's in its embodiedness. It's in its uniqueness. It's in its livingness. So these are some of the basic differences. And if I just will add one thing, the left hemisphere effectively has a map, and the right hemisphere sees the world that is mapped. Now, there's nothing wrong with a map. Very, very useful. We wouldn't be better off without maps, but we would be making a huge mistake if we tried to live in the map, because it's only got a tiny schematic version of reality to offer us. So that's effectively the difference between these hemispheres. And that has philosophical implications, which we can now explore, because it's part one of the new book.
But one interjection is that I think one of the remarkable things about reading your work is how rich it is in meaning. And just now what you've said, this attention is a moral act, which you wrote in your book, I think it's a profound thing to say. And I'm someone who's spent a lot of time thinking about attention and attentional control mechanisms in the brain and the neural circuitry that allows us to change attention. But the idea that attention is partly a choice, but that there's value associated with attention. And we'll come back to value at the end. But it's a profoundly different way, to me, of thinking about neuroanatomy and neural function. That it really goes to define not just how we function, but who we are. And I think this is what, for those of us who study the brain, this is probably what drew us into this field. We're really interested in who we are. And I feel like the book unlocked for me a new way of using neuroanatomy to think about that. A problem to me I thought I had solved in some way.
Yeah, two French philosophers of the last century, Louis Lavelle and Simone Weil, said effectively in their different ways, love is a pure attention to the existence of the other. So how you pay attention creates a relationship out of which something comes that would be different if you paid different attention.
Yeah. So I think in part one of the book, really it's a wonderful, wonderful survey of an extensive history of neuroanatomy, lesion studies, split brain study, collosotomy studies, stroke studies, and as you said, the WADA test, and even some TMS, I think, is in there.
Absolutely.
Really looking at how we have come to understand lateralization and hemispheric asymmetry. So I think it was, as far as I can tell, extremely comprehensive. Now, I came to this as a neurologist and an academic, trying to prove you wrong about it every point I could, and calling friends who did stroke, calling friends who did functional imaging and regional, and it's really, really robust and really thorough. I don't think there's anything you've really missed out in this very beautiful description. And at the same time, it's very readable. So we've come then to understand. Oh, and we've left out the stuff about how robust this is in the animal kingdom. All this wonderful evidence you present of how far back it goes in evolution.
Absolutely.
This asymmetry.
These same differences,
The same differences. So having then established that the two hemispheres compete for representation, that there's some redundant representation between them, I think...
Well, I would make a distinction, but perhaps that's a tricky one to make briefly, between the presence of something and the representation of it. It's the map and the world again. So in the right hemisphere, things are precognitively, the right hemisphere seems aware of them precognitively before it's decided it's one of those and put it in a box. That's the job of the left hemisphere. I see category A, put it in there. And animals and birds do this as well. They use their right and left hemispheres in different ways, which approximate to that distinction. But the thing about a representation is that it literally means re-present, which is not possible because it means it's present again after it was present when it no longer is. So what you've got is something which is already dead and non-existent, an abstraction, a map, a theory, substituting for lived experience.
Right. So it moves us really nicely to the epistemology section, but I think just as a brief interlude, what really struck me moving into that section, how do we know what we know, is that this is a really central question in medicine. It's a central question at this conference. So what we do as clinicians is diagnosis. We categorize people. We try and say this is the abstract representation. So I diagnose someone with multiple sclerosis. I'm saying, if I have two people that I've diagnosed with the same disease, I'm saying I think there's the same physiological process at play, and I'm intending the same treatment plan.
To summarize where we are at the beginning of the second part of the book, I've just looked at all the ways in which we might gather information about the world, through the way we attend, through what we perceive, through the judgments and beliefs we found on what we attend to and perceive, our emotional and social intelligence, our cognitive intelligence, and our creativity. And effectively what I show is the right hemisphere is more reliable and much better at all of these. What's the left hemisphere good at? Grabbing and getting, manipulating, including through language. Not that the right hemisphere doesn't have language, it contributes some of the most important parts to linguistic understanding, but that's another story. But in the second part of the book, I say, okay, given all this, how do we actually make progress towards knowing something at all? And if I were to ask you in this room what sort of things can we rely on, I imagine many of you would say science. I would. Another would be reason. Another, some of you might or might not give, is intuition and possibly imagination. And what I show is that each of these has its proper scope, the things that it can do, and the limitations, the things that it can't do. And that by using them collectively rather than one or two at a time, we see vastly more that's going on. And also, incidentally, that the bit that is most useful, including in science and reason, really the thing that makes the breakthroughs is the right hemisphere, not the left. It's not about linear processes in which you establish one thing and you establish the next, and so on and so on. You build, it's like laying down a brick path towards the truth. Not like that at all. The big insights come as pattern recognition, as deep awareness of connections, and they lead to the sort of moment of illumination.
So do you think what we're doing with diagnosis in medicine, are we missing a right hemispheric approach to our patients? I mean, I think that's what the speakers this morning have been talking about, is a much more what you would call maybe a right hemisphere, holistic, context-dependent, interaction-dependent approach to diagnosis and treatment.
Well, I believe that everything is a relationship. I mean, not just human interactions, but every interaction is an encounter. So that element of the between is really, really important. And so a diagnosis seems rather disembodied, abstract, and so on. And it's often made by ticking boxes. One of these, one of those. Chinese menu is what it's called. One of these, two of those, and we've got a diagnosis, which is the way if any doctor here has ever appeared in court to give an expert opinion, you will know that a barrister will try and tell you the diagnosis is something else because they can do the Chinese menu as well as you can. Unfortunately, they can't. So at its best, I think diagnosis is wonderful, and it's fascinating. It's what I've done most of my life, is being able to spot something's going on here that makes coherent sense that maybe up until now has not been illuminated. Yeah. And then that guides the choice of what to do. But as you could so rightly say, every case, as it were, is a new person, a new patient. And that person has all their life, their different personality, their different understandings of things that they value brought to the picnic. So we do have to take everything into account.
Yeah. Well, and that's what I think. I was struck when Roger Kneebone this morning was talking about silence. And I thought in that moment of silence, we never do that in a clinical encounter. I mean, I never do that.
I think therapists are quite used to sitting with silence. And it's often very creative, because if you jump in, you then cut off something that was actually just about to come to manifest itself. So yeah, I mean, but silence is far more important than words. I'm going to say nothing from now.
We could just sit.
No, but it really is. I mean, the first book I ever wrote in my 20s was called Against Criticism, and it was really about why, when we approach a work of art, do we get it wrong? And we take something that is unique, embodied, and ultimately completely implicit, a poem. You can't explain it any more than you can explain a joke. Well, you can, but then it's no longer a joke. And then we sat down in our earnest seminar rooms and made this unique thing general, this embodied thing abstract, and this implicit thing explicit, and killed it. So I wrote about the silence. The silence is the gaps between the words. And if you think about it, music is pure silence, because what is a note? It's made of notes, apparently. Well, I've looked at notes. I've bombarded them with neutrons in a cloud chamber, and actually, I can tell you that it's a single tone that means nothing. And if you put lots of single tones together that mean nothing, you suddenly get Bach's St. Massey of Passion. Where is all that? Well, it must be in the gaps between the notes.
Yeah. I remember my son was doing an essay recently, and the question was, where is the humor in this sentence? And it was a Groucho Marx quote, and it was something like, oh, my wife's gone on holiday in the Caribbean. You know it. My wife's gone on holiday in the Caribbean, and the friend says,
Jamaica?
And he goes, no, she wanted to go. and my son is, like he's revising and revising and revising for his exams, and he goes, but I don't get it. Jamaica is an island in the Caribbean. And I said, yeah, but Jamaica. And it's just, where is it? Where is it? It's really interesting. But I could see when he was studying for this, he had no access to that, having really thought, but there must be something I must know about geography in order to understand this question. And the more he pushed at that, the more he said, maybe I don't understand where the Caribbean, and he was a little bit confused. Maybe he hasn't never been to the Caribbean, so maybe he didn't know. And he pushed and pushed and pushed and pushed. And I said, you've got to let go. You've got to let go of that pushing and let it come to you.
And also accept that it's quite important not to know things at a certain point in time. Very interesting piece of research shows that the majority of teenagers, if presented with a maths problem like this, will give you an answer. So a shepherd has 30 sheep and 4 sheepdogs. How old is the shepherd? Very few people answer, not enough information here to say. Most of the children will jump in with an estimate. So it's... It's true. So, being able to go, we don't know, and especially when we get into all the really important areas like love and gravity and time and the spiritual and goodness, beauty.
So
and
I want to come to that, but before we move on from epistemology, I think, do you think, I mean, so you express some concern in the book about the degradation of our knowledge, the way we seek knowledge, and even maybe our institutions, science and medicine. And I wonder, this practice, that in your example of the shepherd and the sheepdogs, are children taught that there must be an answer? The reason the question is posed is that there will be an answer, even if that answer is absurd, even if you couldn't possibly know. It's really hard for children. Maybe their intuitive response would have been, how on earth could you know? I think we teach them not to say that.
Exactly.
We teach them that's a trick question and there is an answer.
Yeah, well, what we impress on them somehow is that what they're there to do is to imbibe information.
Right.
But that's not what they're there to do at all. It's to learn how to think critically. And that's something schools lamentably fail to do. You and I last night, we were talking about, what was it? Oh, yes.
You had so many whiskeys last. How do you remember what we talked about? I don't remember what we talked
Whiskey
about.
improves my memory greatly.
No, it's really good.
Sometimes after that, I can remember things that didn't even happen. But I do know.
We did.
I do know that we did actually talk about the possibility of children being taught, as I was, and I think you were saying your son was, taught, that you can put forward a point of view and then you must turn around and argue as powerfully as you can against it, and that you get graded on how good you do on the second exercise, not the first. Now, if only everybody who left school had done that exercise, the world would be a more reasonable, peaceful, kind, harmonious place than it is now.
Well, and I think that is, to me, the real message of this section on epistemology, that it is linked to empathy and compassion. It seems like our knowledge of what is true, how do we know what is true? This seems like a really sort of abstract and academic thing to say, but it does, and we'll come to that now, I think. But it comes into our knowledge about how things work, but our knowledge about values. Ultimately, you lead us to knowledge about values. But first, let's go through metaphysics. So, okay, just briefly, what are time and space?
I'm very glad you asked me that, Ash.
I've merged those together.
I wrote a book about this. No, I mean, I think I'd have to go to a very serious level right away, but maybe we don't want to go too far down that path. But I think they are distinct and very important. And in fact, our misunderstanding of time is one of the things that leads us most astray. We think of it as a succession of moments, like a goods train, where the trucks are held together by links, but it isn't. It's completely fluent. And I have a whole chapter, quite a long one, on motion, on flow, which, I mean, my favorite philosopher of all time, the pre-Socratic philosopher Heraclitus, is mainly known for one of his sayings. He had many, many rich ones, but one is everything flows. And that doesn't just mean everything changes, which is a well-known Buddhist trope, but that everything flows, actually. And so my metaphysics is that what exists are not things. Things are what we call bits of this fluid network that stand out for our attention. And we therefore think the world is made of putting them together. But they're not. The world is there, and these are things we've taken out of it. There's a wonderful Vedic image of Indra's net, which covers the cosmos. And at every crossing in this net, there is suspended a jewel in which all the other jewels in the net are also reflected. This idea brings together a whole load of things, including, of course, the way in which parts and wholes are nested. So what seems to be a part at one level is a whole at another, and the holographic nature of existence, but also this thing about connections, because a net is simply made from threads. And the places where they cross, we go, aha, something there. I'm going to call that a thing. That's very roughly what I think is wrong there. But the implications for time and space would take me a while to unpack.
Well, no, and we don't need to unpack all of them, but I think one interesting thing, going back to the anatomy, is this we're often unaware that we stitch together saccadic eye movement. So we stitch together our continuous visual world from a series of individual snapshots. And really, probably, we do that with all attention. We have attentional snapshots. We bind together a continuous feeling of reality from that.
Well, that's the way medicine works. Take it apart. When you've got the parts, you know the whole. Yeah. But actually, you don't. Not in our tradition, not in anybody's tradition. It's just an intermediary process which gives you certainly some knowledge as a staging post for putting it together again and seeing it in a new way enriched. You analyze in order to find an integral whole that now is enriched by the unfolding of what was implicit in it earlier. So that idea is important. The idea that contraries also coincide, we could just touch on that very briefly. Because in the world in which we live, we believe that if you go far enough in a certain direction, you'll get ultimately as far as you possibly can do from whatever it is you're running from. But it's a psychological truth, and in fact it's also a physics-based truth, that if you go far enough, you start to come round its curve to where you started. And that opposites very often coincide, and that by trying to make more and more of something, we actually produce its opposite. This is very well known in history from the fact that movements that were liberation movements turned into the greatest tyrannies the world has ever seen.
Exactly. So I think now, so we start. I mean, just to remember, this journey is it's really remarkable that we start from very, very clear, very well established hemispheric asymmetries, functional asymmetries. And then we move to the nature of knowledge. How do we know what there is? And then we move to how do we know what there is in the world, sort of metaphysics. And then really you bring this wonderfully to value, to spirituality, to something really, really deeply meaningful. Not just an exercise, and isn't it interesting that we stitch together reality? Isn't it interesting that the brain works in this quite cool way? And we're glossing over all of the many, many interesting things about stroke syndromes and confabulation and all of this wonderful tour through the history of neurology and neuroanatomy that we get.
Well, that's over 400 pages in itself.
Exactly.
So that's almost like a book,
But then we get to this wonderful section on value and spirituality. So can you tell us about that?
Well, yes, I set myself the task in the last part of the book of saying, so what is there when we've looked at which we should prefer, the take of the left, the take of the right hemisphere, which paths should we use? What do we actually find there? And apart from some preliminary chapters on the coincidence of opposites and the relationship between the one and the many, I have things on time, space, matter, consciousness, all the things that you would think would be there. But I then also have 3 final chapters: values, purpose, and the sense of the sacred. Now, my academic colleagues in philosophy said, don't say about the sense of the sacred. The book's full of good philosophy, but no one will take you seriously if you mention the sacred. But I have this little perverse streak, I told you about that. Don't touch hemispheres. I've been touching them ever since.
Yeah.
And I just thought, no, to leave that out would be ridiculous. We do leave it out of our discourse because nobody feels comfortable with how to approach it, what to say about it, or where to put it. But if you continually ignore it, it suggests that it really doesn't exist or matter. And yet I believe it has profound significance to everything else. So I couldn't just leave that. And it took me more pains than anything I've ever written. It's over 100 pages, that one chapter. But what I'm looking at there is, yes, as you say, values in general. Are they really constituents of the universe, or are they not things that we paint onto the world in order to cheer ourselves up? And although a lot of people seem to believe that latter idea, I can't hold it, and most great philosophers I know of, including completely atheistic ones, don't hold it either. They hold, quite rightly, that just as consciousness can't be reduced to matter if matter is conceived of as purely, completely unconscious, and of course, if you conceive it as already having some consciousness, then you've solved the hard problem already, that values like goodness, truth, and beauty are pre-existent. They are not derivable from anything. They're there. Of course, they're differently interpreted at different times in different places, though much less so than you'd think. And they play different parts in people's philosophy of life. But they're something that we either respond to or we don't. It's not something we invent. It's something we discover. In other words, reveal. And we can get good at revealing it and understanding it and bringing it into being for us, bringing it into the world that we create by our attention, or we can banish it. And when we do, the results are diabolical, almost literally, because things go very, very badly wrong, as they have for us in the last 200 years, in which we've virtually destroyed the world through our lack of understanding of values.
So I was thinking, and we can be thinking about questions, because I think in a few minutes we'll take some questions, but I was sort of thinking about what the ultimate, the ultimate practical advice of the book would be. I mean, what I thought, particularly in the first section, is that we should all have a left hemisphere stroke, first of all. That seemed to be maybe quite a good thing. But in any way, we should appreciate this right hemispheric model of reality, which in your argument, you've very clearly made a case that it's been subjugated and that's been a cultural force.
Yeah.
So it's not just the anatomy of the brain. It's that we're choosing to shape the brain. The brain it changes over time, and we're making these value-laden choices.
Yes, briefly, I can say, and the evidence is in this very long book, that if we model the world according to the way the left hemisphere sees it, we're grossly distorting it and don't understand it. And the proof of the pudding is in the eating. We now simply have no clue who we are, what the world is, how the two relate, what we're doing here. So there's that it's important for us to have some sense of these values, and that they are foundational. Yeah. What was it you just said before, at the end of what you said to me just now?
I was actually just thinking about the whiskey, because what was interesting about honestly, the older whiskey, it was we had a Talisker 25. Iain lives on the Isle of Skye, which is I think an incredibly remarkable place to live. In Talisker House, and we had this Talisker whiskey, this old Talisker whiskey, and the difference between the new one and the old one, to me, was very much this sort of there is something really interesting about the whole, like these. Perceiving a thing as a whole.
That's a nice segue. I think yes, but ultimately that values are very important, and that the set of values changes our vision of reality. So at the end of the book, I do sort of paint a picture of where we are now and the sort of world that we might be aware of, that in the past people have been aware of, and it's been embodied in their culture. And in other parts of the world they have, and still are to some extent, to the extent that we haven't westernized them, able to understand these things. And the master in his emissary, I just had this image of this wise master who was usurped by an emissary who was bright, but not bright enough to know what it was he didn't know. And that's the danger. It's not ignorance, but ignorance of ignorance that causes the problems. And so I just took that idea, and then I found in the subsequent reading for this new book that this very myth is present all over the world. It's there in the 8th century, 9th century Chinese classic, The Secret of the Golden Flower. It's there in the Vedanta. It's there in a North American Iroquois myth, with which I begin part 3, about two brothers. And I can't rehash it for you briefly, but it's stunning. It just is like they intuited the interior relation of the left hemisphere as sort of slightly ignorant, but rather dangerous and brash, and the right hemisphere is holding the whole picture and needing to be the one that takes charge of the whole picture. So this right and left hemisphere, it's not true that we want a left hemisphere stroke. My left hemisphere has proved very useful. I wouldn't have been able to write any books without it. So it's very important. But the right hemisphere should always be the superintendent. It's not an equal relationship. The right hemisphere sees more, understands more, is more temperate. The left hemisphere is rash, impulsive, sees very little, but drives us with its own agenda. And I think we're being driven by this agenda of the left hemisphere, and we drastically need to recalibrate.
I think at an emotional level, I heard a talk recently by an Amazonian tribal leader, and she was talking about her lands in Ecuador having been, it was called Oil Block 22. The Ecuadorian government had defined this region of the Amazon jungle, and they quantified it. They said it's got this resource, it's got this, so we can move this tribe to another region of the jungle which is equivalent. And she said, no, but our people, we hunt here. We know how these trees work. We know how these rivers work. This is our bit of the forest, and it's different to the other bit of the forest. And the government sort of said, no, it's not. It's all these ways. Actually, you're getting more forest. And she said this remarkable thing. She said, if you pay attention, then you know. And you know it's different. And it doesn't need explanation why it's different, but you know that it's different.
That's right.
And we don't tune into that voice often enough, I think, that says we know a thing.
Absolutely. And there's a sequence in a film called The Divided Brain, which was made about my work, where I'm talking with Leroy Littlebear, who's a Blackfoot chief in Canada. And it's a wonderful scene, I think. I don't know, have you seen it?
No.
It's brilliant, actually, because he says, this mountain, these trees, they are my brothers and sisters, they are my family. And he thinks of them all as alive. He said, everything is in flux. I mean, he's been listening to Heraclitus. And, this whole idea, he says, there is no word in our language for inanimate. This is a picture that is completely different, and it's typically destructive. This, appalling story of the oil searching, which just takes everything that's unique and contextual and living and just says, no, it's a resource for me to grab. Don't forget, the left hemisphere is effectively seeing the world as a heap of resource. I can grab that, I can get that, either for food or for shelter or for my purposes in manipulating the world, not in helping me understand the world.
Well done, excellent. I think we can take some questions. Shall we? There are roving microphones. If you could just stand up, because I don't think, if you've got a microphone, just stand up. I think there's someone over here needs a microphone, and we got some over here.
Fascinating conversation, thank you very much. Just in the context of what Dr. McGilchrist said about time and also the sense of the sacred, would you just care to comment on the concept of a soul and its connection with the belief in immortality and a connection into God and gods? Thanks very much.
So that's good. That's a short question as well.
Yes.
Is there a soul? Is there a God? And is there immortality?
Yes. Yes. No. No, I don't know. No.
Next question.
No. I mean, of course, these are vast topics. And in the last chapter, what I had to do was kind of, first of all, detoxify the topic by refusing to use the word God initially, although I brought it in at a later stage. But in all religious traditions in the world, there is a taboo on naming this thing, because once you've named it, you think you've got it. And the Tao, the Tao Te Ching, the main work of Taoist literature, begins, the Tao that can be named is not the real Tao. And in fact, St. Augustine said, if you think you understand God, it's not God you've understood. So these are vast topics which defy language and conceptualizing. But I do my best to deal with them in this long chapter 28 of my book. And I certainly don't I do believe in something divine, yes. To say what the soul is, I did actually give a talk at the RSA about 10 years ago, which is available on the internet, called Whatever Happened to the Soul. But essentially, I think it's a concept we can't do without. Immortality, I don't know about. They failed to give me the text on that one, so I don't know. But what I do believe is that our consciousness, my consciousness, your consciousness, are part of some greater field of consciousness that for a moment is individuated. And one way of thinking of this, since most of you have a biology training, you can imagine a cell that has a sort of outpouching in its membrane. And if you imagine yourself being in the cytoplasm in the middle of that outpouching, you'd think you were completely separate from everything else, unless you looked at the one place at the foot where it is connected to the whole of the rest of the cytoplasm. So at one and the same time, you can see yourself as truly, in a way, distinct, but not actually ultimately distinct at all. So what I think we do is bring into being for a while a form that is unique and is real. Take a whirlpool in a stream or a wave in the sea. Then the wave is not separate from the sea, it's the form that the sea takes at that moment. The whirlpool is not separate from the river, it's the form that the river takes at that moment. You can photograph it. It has power. It can move stones. But nonetheless, it has its period and then is part of something greater. And the fact that it has existed unpacks part of the potential that's in the verb to be. I see the cosmos as constantly enriching the idea of what being means by individuating, but at the same time not disintegrating. In fact, furthering the meaning of integration. So it's rather like one of those paper flowers, the Chinese paper flowers. You put them in water and they unfold. And in the unfolding, they're no less a flower. In fact, they're more a flower than they were before.
Hello. I just wanted to run something past both of you that I've read and to hear your comments. If I could be anything, and I see people and I see what they do, I'd love to be like a Zen Buddhist or somebody who's similar, very calm, very peaceful. And something I've read on the internet about DMT in our brains. Is it possible that these Zen monks, these people, are microdosing on DMT or similar on a fairly regular or constant basis? I just care for your comments. Thank you.
Do you want to go first?
I think I've got a friend who's a Buddhist monk, and he is definitely not microdosing on DMT. What he's microdosing on is chocolate ice cream, pretty consistently. I don't know about these. I do think meditation can produce altered states, but I don't know if I'd say it was. I wouldn't point to a specific neurochemical.
Well, I think pointing to specific neurochemicals is never very helpful. I mean, we were talking about love, and somebody pinpointing noradrenaline, serotonin, dopamine. But noradrenaline, serotonin, dopamine are all over your body, and they have hundreds of different functions. The fact that the experience of love comes about is not in one whit illuminated by the fact of talking about neurochemicals. It makes you sound clever, but it isn't really, because what you're talking about is an experience that cannot be reduced to chemicals. However, in the hypothalamus, DMT is secreted. It's a naturally occurring psychoactive substance. But I don't think that, like you, I don't think that the processes of meditation are much illuminated by that. I don't think, in fact, most monks prioritize, or most mystical traditions prioritize a feeling of ecstasy or bliss.
No,
fact,
I think that's an excellent point.
I think that's actually thought of as somewhat meretricious, and that really what is important is clearing your mind of all the obfuscating stuff that our left hemisphere does, like chattering, categorizing, judging, and seeing what comes into the space, what I characterize as active receptivity. In other words, not just blankly sitting there waiting, but listening. And that's what I think one cultivates. And it does have correlations with right hemisphere measurable parameters. So people who indulge in mindfulness meditation, parts of their right cortex and the cingulate enlarge in keeping with the practice. So one can make these reductionist comparisons, but they're not, in the end, terribly illuminating.
But I think the act of meditation is very interesting in terms of hemispheric competition. Because if you try to be still and quiet, and you try to still your mind in that way, your mind shouts at you so loudly, and it's very, very difficult to pull away from that and return your focus and return your focus. And I think to me, I mean, I do very little meditation, but it's sort of this act of constantly returning your focus to a sort of an empty focus. It's incredibly difficult. And I think that is really sort of an experiential evidence of the hemispheric hypothesis. Why is it so difficult to do this really simple thing? So I would say my friend who's a monk, he, at the beginning of his career, he did have these drug-like experiences through meditation, long silent retreats, sitting in lotus position for days and weeks. And his Lama said, you've got to stop doing this. He said, you're meditating like an addict. You're looking for a high, you're looking for bliss, you're looking for euphoria, and that's going to stop you from understanding meditation. And so he said, you can't do the silent retreats until you can stop seeking this thrill.
Yes, in Buddhism there's something called beginner's mind, which is a nice irony because it's something you can only achieve after years and years of practice. But it's to think again naively rather than to do Buddhist practices. Because as soon as you're doing Buddhist practices, that's completely non-Zen for a start. And so you have to sort of shake that off and go back to the first idea that you could have had of what it was you were trying to achieve. Have you got a microphone?
Oh, there's one coming just behind you there.
Yeah.
Handedness have any effect on which side, if you're left-handed, is the right, is the hemispheres sort of switch then, or what happens there? You're left or right?
I might just repeat it because we might have missed. So does handedness
Yes.
have any effect on
Right
what
on.
you represent? So if I grab this with my right
Yeah,
hand,
yeah.
or I grab it with my left hand, is that the question? Will it be different? Okay.
Yeah, I mean, briefly, handedness doesn't equate easily to anything I'm talking about. So there are three categories of left-handedness. One is basically the brain is arranged in the way that it is in a right-hander, largely. Another is that it's more or less a mirror image, which is rare. But the other is that somehow there's a mix, and that's much commoner. But what is intriguing is that even in left-handers who use that right hemisphere to control their left hand, when they conceive tools and machines, they do so with the left hemisphere. It's that strong. The left hemisphere is the hemisphere of tools and machines, and therefore not very good at understanding people. I mean, of course, in the anatomy room, one saw that this body was made up of an arm on that table and a hand over there and so on. But of course, a whole body comes into being at the same time. Organs are not made and added. The whole thing differentiates into something that, lo and behold, has a heart and a spleen and a whatever.
Yeah. We had to decide early on, by the way, who got to be in your left visual field and who got to be in your right visual field. Iain wanted to be in the right hemisphere, so that's where he is. So we've taken it practically. I think maybe we have time for one more question. Quickly, over there.
You mentioned early on, guys, about attention as a moral actor. How do you feel about the idea of the attention economy? Do you think the way technology is in the world today could have, is having profound implications on, how we are as people?
Yeah. Well, to a corporation, your attention is the most valuable thing you have. And so there's a war for your attention. And it results in frustration, unhappiness, incoherence, anxiety, and gloom when our attention is fragmented. Nothing makes any sense anymore. So it's terrifically important to limit as much as possible the interruptions to your attention and to have a period in the day when nothing can interrupt your attention and use it. It's really what you were talking about, trying to redirect your attention in that way. But no, it is... it's a very serious problem. It's a dehumanization, as so many things that we're witnessing around us are now. They're denying the specific things about a living being and pretending that we're just like machines that can be made to attend. In fact, no machine ever attends at all. You can't attend without a consciousness, because attention is the way you dispose your consciousness towards something. But you need to cherish that attention, because it changes who you are and what you find in the world.
I think I'll end it there. I mean, it does strike me that many times at this conference we've talked about the quality of attention that we pay as clinicians and how to reconcile this way of seeing what we do, which is a human interaction, a therapeutic encounter, with the fact that we're also doing science. We're data-driven, we're evidence-driven, and it's a great privilege, I think, as we all know, being in this sort of field, that we can marry these two ways. That we must marry these two ways,
Yeah.
and we do it as a kind of part of our daily job, which is a really nice thing. So, Iain, thank you very much. It's been a real honor to be on stage with you.
Thank you, Ash.
Thank you.